Okay, so welcome everyone to to Guillaume's defense. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Just to start out with a few things about using Zoom. So all of you are set, I think, as attendees, and a few of us are set as panelists. So I think you won't be able to see each other, perhaps until the end if we figure out how to turn that feature on. If you have a question, so Guillaume is happy to take questions, I think, during his talk. In fact, I think he'd feel a little bit more comfortable if you reach out and talk to him. It's sort of lonely talking just to your computer. So if you want to do so, then write a message in the chat box. So if you click on the chat and then you add a little message, I think all of you know how to do that by now. And then Akshay and I will be trying to monitor that. And if it's a question that seems like it's a good time for Guillaume, then either Akshay and I will kind of interject, or if it seems like it's better to be for later in the talk, then we'll just reserve that, and you can get your question answered at the end of the talk. So the best way to get in touch with us throughout the talk is through the chat button. Okay, so so with that aside, and at the end there'll be a Q&A period, and I think there'll be an extended Q&A period where it'll be sort of you can ask questions, and we'll turn on and off your mics and so forth, and so you'll be able to ask questions. Okay, so with that aside, I want to say, first of all, that I am speaking on behalf of myself and Tony Norcia, because we co-mentored, had the great pleasure of co-mentoring Guillaume over the last, I guess, 5 years now. So Guillaume came to us from Brown University into the neuroscience graduate program. And I'd say when he first contacted me about doing a rotation in my lab, I did what one does these days. I did a little Google search on Guillaume, and up came, I think many of you have seen these kinds of videos, if I have, of Guillaume juggling. And I have to say this, I always felt a little bit embarrassed to tell you this, but I'll tell you this now, which is that when I was an undergraduate, I also was very interested in juggling. I spent a few years in what they called the Anti-Gravity Society. Yes. So I know from sort of years of trying to juggle like this, that the way that Guillaume juggles is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of perseverance, a lot of practice, and a lot of determination. But it also has this sort of like joyous quality to it. So I think that like you can tell if you encourage you to go look at these videos of Guillaume juggling. It's like there's obviously this kind of joyousness in discovery of these things that you can do, and also in wanting to share that with other people, to try to make that easy for other people to do. And I was looking at this, and I was never anywhere near as good a juggler as you. I was hoping that maybe someday you can teach me some of these tricks. But I felt, these are exactly the qualities that make for an excellent graduate student. And I was really happy that, Guillaume decided to first rotate in the lab, and then later joined the lab to come work with me and Tony Norcia over the years. And I think this kind of sort of joyous, but also creative and perseverance, very, just will keep after it until he gets it. And we want to share, these are the qualities that I first encountered looking at these videos, and they've really, I think, panned out very nicely for you as a graduate student. And so I want to say that for me, I think, your graduate career has been, I never had any worries for you. And I should say I'm usually a very worried person, but I never worried at all. And that may kind of sound maybe strange to you at this point, because I know, you probably didn't feel that it was always so unproblematic, what your project was going to be. And I remember having all these discussions with you along the way. You and me and Tony would have lots and lots of discussions about what it is that you were going to do, or when you had a roadblock that took a long time, and it was a lot of really hard work. Yet I was never worried that it wouldn't end up in a sort of unique place that it did, and I think it really did, and I never worried, because I sort of understood that you were not the kind of graduate student that, well, you're the kind of graduate student that I think when one thinks about what this sort of mentor-mentee relationship would ideally be someone who you would act as a sounding board to. As a mentor, I would act as a sounding board to someone who we talk to, but the ideas would come from you. There'd be your path to discovery, and we would just be there along the way. And I think that's the way that Tony and I, when we first started talking with you, sort of realized that you weren't the type of person who you just wanted to have something handed to them and then they were just going to work really hard and get that done. It was very important to you that you would have your own path to discovery. And I should say, I think that probably made your life a lot more difficult than it had to be. But it ended up in a place that I think, I think, all of us can see now is really uniquely your own. And I hope as people watch your talk and see that you can really see the imprints of Guillaume in the science that he did, the way that he approached the problems, the way that he tackled and solved the problems in his thesis. Very unique and creative, and a mark of someone who has their own path. And it's just been a great pleasure to work with you on this. Let me see what I have to say. I should say, as many of you know, that Guillaume's passions are not just, scientific passions, I should say, are not just in terms of research, but he's really believes strongly in sharing his passion for science and his ability to really explain very complex and interesting things in simple ways that make you interested in them. And I think many of you have probably seen all of his YouTube videos, and if you haven't, you really need to go to look at his YouTube page. You can see that along with all the juggling videos, I think he's making less juggling videos now and more videos about science. So there's some change over the years in your focus. But you can see these videos where people have looked. There's one here with 1.5 million views. And I think I should say that it's just a unique and interesting, eclectic set of topics that make that Guillaume's interested in, and you don't think you're going to be interested, or maybe you won't think you're interested until you sort of watch these videos, and you'll see really how Guillaume is able to express this kind of joyfulness about science, about knowledge, about thinking, and make it something that you want to learn about too. And so he's done a number of these things. I think some of you also know that he's been getting awards at the Society for Neuroscience conference for his videos explaining all sorts of different topics, from illusions to how ketamine treats depression, and I think others. And for those of you who don't know, the Society for Neuroscience is the sort of largest conference in neuroscience, not just for American scientists, but scientists all across the world. So this is a great honor for him to have been, for his videos to be selected for these prizes. I've also been really fortunate to kind of been able to get him to come help me teach undergraduates, and he's made these games, which I'll just say, one of the things that's very unique about Guillaume is he can take very complex, sometimes mathematical, computational ideas, things like Hopfield networks, and express them without using computers at all. So he invented this game having to do with cards and poker chips that demonstrate these ideas of this kind of network and how it reaches stable patterns and does pattern separation and so forth, just with these kind of basic tools. And I think this sort of joyful and creative way of exploring knowledge of people is really infectious. And certainly all the undergraduates have really benefited greatly and enjoyed learning from Guillaume, and will continue to learn from him in the future from these games and other things that he's done. So it's just been a great pleasure having him also as an educator and someone who promotes kind of the teaching of science. And so I'm going to hand it over to Guillaume in a second. I just want to say, in the last few words, I'd just like to say that we're living in this sort of uncertain time right now, and I think maybe there's you're thinking about your future, and perhaps there's some uncertainty, perhaps you have, some concerns about it. I guess I should say that I'm also, again, finding myself not worried about what the future is for you, just because I don't know where exactly you will be in a few years and what you will do, but I know whatever you do will be creative, it will be unique, it will bring in other people into science, and I'm just really excited to see where that takes you. And I'm very grateful for having been part of the journey for you over the last 5 years. It's been really wonderful having you in the lab, and I'm excited for your future. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Guillaume.
Thanks so much, Justin. It really means a lot. I appreciate it. Let me see if I can get my slides up. All righty. Yeah, so as you said, these are strange times, and so welcome to my Zoom defense. I appreciate everybody coming. Apparently you can't see each other, but there are, no, I can't see many people there are either. There are a bunch of you here, and I appreciate everybody turning out to check this out with me. Let me see if I can set this up the way that I want. Okay, Okay. Well, I had instructions for you guys to change your own views, but I'm not sure if you can in a webinar. Well, we'll go with this. Okay, so the title of my talk is Human Perception of Intermediately Fusible Visual Stimuli, which will hopefully make some sense by the end of this. The informal title is What Do You See When Your Eyes Don't Agree? I'm sorry, does anybody know how I can make this split screen from sharing a screen so that the videos aren't covering it?
The panelist videos?
Do you currently see the video feeds as covering part of the slides, or is that just on my screen?
No, we can see this. I can see the slides and you above that when I turn off side by side.
Okay, great. Apparently it's just on my screen. Okay, sounds good. To a roaring start here. All right, so brief outline of this talk. It's going to be about 45 or 50 minutes or so, hopefully. I'm going to start with some background about the previous literature and the state of things before I started my own work. Then I'm going to talk about two sort of little project arcs that I did during my research. Each one has a perceptual component where I did an experiment and had people tell me what they saw, and then a modeling component where I tried to kind of computationally understand what might have produced those experiences for people. And of course, at the end, there will be some kind of conclusion. So a bit of broad background. As you all know, when you walk around the world, you have the experience of seeing a unified and continuous view of what's around you. People often think of seeing as similar to taking a picture with a camera, kind of a straightforward observation of the world. But as any vision scientist will tell you, there's a lot more going on than you might expect. And there are a lot of dynamic inferential processes that are necessary to produce this impression of straightforward single vision. One of the most basic problems that our brain faces in producing this experience is that we have two eyes. And as predators, they're front-facing, and a lot of what they see overlaps. So how do we incorporate these two different views into this single experience? In computer science, this is known as the correspondence problem. So if you have two images from slightly different locations, as your eyes have, shown here, you have to somehow find a way to overlap them so that they can be appropriately related to each other, and the same points, the same objects in space can be related on your image. So to first order, the way that we solve this as animals is just to move our eyes around. You have this vergence movement where your eyes can move laterally. That's why you go cross-eyed when you look really close to yourself. And you basically just line things up so that they match on your retinas where you're actually getting the signals. But this process isn't entirely just a mechanical overlap. There's actually some kind of processing that's helping these connections be made. So this has been known for a while. There was some research done in the late 60s by Fender and Julesz, where they actually stabilized images on the backs of people's retinas. So normally if you move your eyes, obviously the image on the back of your eye changes, but they found a way to make the image stay solid exactly where it is on the back of your eye. And they would show people something like two different vertical bars, one in each eye. And if they're slightly offset, you'll have double vision, what's called diplopia, where you see both bars at once. Of course, if you line them up exactly on the retinas, you'll see a single image and they'll be combined together. But after you do that, you can actually pull them a little bit further apart than you otherwise would have been able to. And you still have this single experience of just one bar. And you have to pull them apart far enough that they finally kind of snap back into this double vision mode. So there's something within your visual process which is somehow keeping these matches aligned, even when they're not exactly on target on your retinas. Now, on top of this problem of just general alignment, there's also the issue that the images in each eye are slightly different because of perspective and depth. So if you look closely at the nose on this sculpture, there's slightly different angles to the features in each eye's view because you're looking at it from different perspectives. So a simple way to show you this in real life, since you can't look at 3D glasses experiences in this talk, is just to point at the center of your vision. So point at yourself right between your eyes. You'll feel a bit silly, but do it. And then close one eye at a time and look at your finger. You'll notice that neither eye sees the finger pointing at it because, of course, your finger is pointing between your eyes. So each eye sees the finger kind of pointing past it. But if you open both of your eyes, you have this experience of a finger pointing right at you. So somehow the different images that each eye is seeing aren't just being overlapped, but they're actually being somehow combined into a new image, which has a different feature than either of them, which is this central pointing experience. Another way to show you this has to do with contrast and kind of signal detection. So this demo is going to have you close one of your eyes. So pick one. Now you should be looking at the screen with one eye and try to read as far as you can along this sequence of numbers as they get fainter and fainter. And note the last number that you're able to read. Now I'm going to have you open both of your eyes and see if you can read a few more numbers. And hopefully, if this works properly, depending on your screen and everything, you might be able to read 2 or 3 more numbers than you could before. The reason for this is because your brain is able to take advantage of the improved signal by literally having 2 different observations of this faint set of numbers. So although the contrast is very low, if you look at it with 2 eyes and then combine those signals in a useful way, you can actually read a number that one eye alone couldn't see. That's called contrast summation. I'm being told my internet connection is unstable. Am I legible to everyone? Can everyone hear me properly?
Yeah, you're fine so far.
Okay, good. So hopefully I've convinced you so far that your eyes, though they have different views, are doing something to meaningfully combine these 2 views into this unified perspective that you experience when you're seeing the world. But what about parts of the image that just don't match up? So there's a convenient example in this stereo pair where you can see the little corner of this plinth is visible in one view but not the other. And if you think about it, this is true in any case where there's a depth edge because one eye can see around it while the other one can't. So there's a little bit of extra visual space that's provided to one eye because it has that different vantage point. So there's a lot of research about this sort of thing and it's very complicated, but in general, in normal vision, the eye with the better view just kind of sees what it sees and the other eye is suppressed. But in lab settings, you can take this a bit further and make matches that are completely impossible to reconcile. So this has been done a really long time ago in the 1800s. Wheatstone invented this device called a stereoscope, which is basically just 2 mirrors you put in front of your eyes that project images from the sides into each eye. So you can now show somebody a totally different picture in each eye independently. And if you do something like show them totally different gradings in each eye, then they'll actually switch off over time. So you'll see one eye's view, and then after a while, you'll see the other eye's view, and they'll switch back and forth dynamically. This is called binocular rivalry. This has garnered a lot of attention scientifically over the hundreds of years since it's been studied, partly because it's just fascinating that you're looking at these static images, but somehow your brain is, without your conscious intention, choosing which one of them to serve up to you as an experience over time. There's some kind of perceptual dynamo that's being revealed here, where you normally, as I said earlier, think of your vision as kind of just being a camera, but really there's some kind of process in between, which is choosing what sorts of percepts will result from the inputs you're getting. Even if they're not actually changing, they're just not matching. So we've learned a lot about binocular rivalry. I'm just going to touch on something which is most relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the distribution of durations for how long each eye is seen. So as I said, it's kind of random as it switches back and forth, but if you measure how long each eye is seeing for, and you plot all these different durations over time, you'll see that it's pretty close to log normal. So in log space, it's a normal distribution, which means that in regular space, it's got a long tail of longer durations where most of them are kind of shorter, on the order of a few seconds or so. So I can't show you binocular rivalry, unfortunately. I like to normally pass out 3D glasses in my talks so people can actually see this process going on. But there is a presumably related phenomenon, which I can show you, which is monocular rivalry. So I'm going to have you look at the little central sunburst there with both of your eyes and just kind of relax your vision as you're looking at it. And hopefully over time, one set of bars or the other will kind of start to float to the surface and the other one will recede into darkness. And if you keep looking, you might see it switch to the other set of bars. And you'll have this same kind of dynamic perceptual process where one and then the other is being kind of served up to you for your viewing. And these exchanges also are actually log normally distributed, interestingly, though it's a different phenomenon. There's some kind of relationship between these effects. So again, this is just kind of a presumably related, but not directly related phenomenon, just to give you a sample of what it's like to see these things changing over time, even though they're actually static. So in the literature, fusion and rivalry were generally modeled separately. So There were models of fusion, which were static, and they would be concerned with things like contrast summation, which I showed you. So how dark or bright something will seem based on the way it's combined in each eye. And stereopsis, which is this process of extracting depth from the slight differences between the two images. Those would just have an input and then an output, and that's kind of a model. There's no time component necessarily. And then there's models of rivalry, which are usually concerned with this dynamic process, and they want to predict things like when your view will shift to the other eye over time, how long the eye will stay dominant, things like that. And these models, since they're concerned with really different images in each eye, often don't even allow for the possibility of fusion. They're just trying to figure out which eye is going to be dominant at each point. Okay. So my first project basically was concerned with figuring out what happens between these two extreme, well-studied cases. So here's kind of a cartoon of these prior views. I think fusion is generally kind of thought of as success, visually speaking. So binocular fusion is a successful solution to this problem of correspondence, and it's stable. It's like the right answer, and it's going to stick that way for as long as it works. And then binocular rivalry is kind of thought of this as this strange failure state that happens in lab settings if you have really unusual things going into both your eyes. So there is an implicit assumption that there is a threshold between these states. So studies of fusion would use very similar stimuli, often kind of bar gratings because they're very easy to parameterize. You have slightly different orientations, for example, they'll combine and be fused. And rivalry would use very different ones like orthogonal gratings that would switch back and forth. And it was sort of assumed that between these, there's some threshold similarity. So that if correspondence is possible, you'll experience fusion. And if they're too different, then you'll go into this failure state and have rivalry. And it's kind of hard to pin down people's thoughts on this. This is kind of my interpretation of the literature. But I think this sort of grew from earlier work, as I mentioned, with things like diplopia based on retinal locations, because there was this observation that you would have kind of a snappy shift from correct fusion to diplopia if the difference became too large. And so that idea was extended into this space where you have threshold similarity between features, in this case orientation, but you could imagine this with like different colors or motion or things like that. So my question was just what happens at this or near this threshold of similarity? Do you actually have a snappy transition between fusion and rivalry, or does something else go on? So here's the experiment I designed to try to address that question. And basically all I did, as the title says, is parametrically vary fusibility. So if you show vertical bars to both eyes, which are the same, they have 0 degrees of orientation disparity, then they'll fuse. If you show orthogonal bars with 90 degrees of disparity, they'll rival. And all I did was try different orientations between those numbers. So here's the setup I used. It's actually very similar to the stereoscope from the 1800s. This one has a one-way mirror so that you have 2 different monitors and each eye can see one monitor. And that allows me to show people different images in their eyes. So here are some example stimuli. We have this central dot in both eyes, which I tell people to fixate on, keep their eyes focused on that as much of the time as they can. And then these outer rings kind of just match up and help them stay fixated because it helps have your brain have something to grab onto that matches in each image. And what they were looking at is these little faint bar patterns in the background, which have an orientation. And the task I gave my observers was in real time to hold down one of 3 keys based on what they saw. So if those little bar patterns seemed like they were perfectly vertically aligned with the reference dots on the top and bottom, they would hold down the up arrow key, as long as it seemed that way. If it seemed like the bars were rotated counterclockwise, they'd hold left. And if they were clockwise rotated, they'd hold right. And if it was something in between or kind of an uncertain outcome, they would just let go of all the keys. So I showed people a range of different orientation disparities. And again, these are just static images. I would show a different orientation to each eye and just leave it there for 60 seconds. I would do this twice for every amount of disparity. So I'd switch which eye was seeing which image. That's what I mean by both polarities. And I did this for 11 subjects. Okay, so I'm going to show you the results. And on the y-axis here, we have the viewing time. So out of those 60 seconds, how much of the time were you seeing either aligned, clockwise or counterclockwise, or no response? And on the x-axis, we have the stimulus condition. So in the middle, we have the perfectly aligned vertical bars. On the edges, we have the totally different bars that don't match at all. And in the middle, we have the intermediate cases. So if the threshold idea were true, you might expect to see something kind of like this, where for similar stimuli, that are close to perfectly aligned, you would always see them as vertical, and people would just hold the up key the whole time. And then beyond some amount of difference on either side, you would go into rivalry where people are somewhat randomly going left and right, and about half the time you would see each one. But that's not what I saw. What I saw looked like this. So you can see that the transition is much smoother, and there's actually an intermediate range here where both outcomes can happen. So in this zone, you can either see a vertical aligned stimulus, which is fused between both eyes, or a rotated left or rotated right stimulus where one eye is dominant. So I'm calling this the tristable zone, since all three of those outcomes can happen. So this means that fusion is now dynamic, where previously people thought of fusion as sort of the right answer, which the brain came to and just sticks with. Now we have fusion happening and then going away, even though the stimuli themselves are not changing. So this means we can look at fusion in the same kind of ways that we would look at rivalry. For example, we can look at its duration distribution. So the first thing I looked at is to see whether rivalry in this case was still log normally distributed. So we have here, I took the log of all the durations and I plotted them. And you can see that the z-scores are normally distributed, which means that the durations of rivalry, so the left and right eye views in this weird tristable state, are still log normally distributed. You can see this even a little bit better by doing this cumulative style plot, and you can see how well that red line, the log normal fit, matches with the blue data that we saw. So rivalry is still behaving like rivalry in this state in terms of this duration distribution. And it turns out that fusion looks quite similar. It's a little bit messier, maybe because there's less data since fusion was only happening a third of the time. But it is kind of roughly log normal. So it seems like maybe fusion is engaging in the same kind of dynamics as the two ocular dominance states normally do in rivalry. So I wanted to learn more about this tristable state. So I went back and got more data. So for each subject, I looked at their reports, and I found the amount of orientation disparity that for them resulted in the most equal amount of left eye, right eye, and fused views. And I call these the most tristable points. Here are two examples of that. And for most subjects, that was around 30 or 35 degrees of orientation disparity. So I collected some more data. I collected 6 more minutes at that orientation disparity for each subject. So now I had 8 total minutes of data for all my 11 subjects. And this is all just this unusual state with all 3 cases possible. And this is the data that I'm going to talk about for the rest of this little project arc. So I wanted to do some modeling now that I had these time courses of perception to try to see what could be causing these 3 states to alternate the way that they were. Let me just give you a little bit of background and back up for a second to talk about how rivalry is generally modeled. So I mentioned earlier there are these dynamic models that try to predict how the switches happen. The general way that this is done is with 2 units kind of abstractly that inhibit each other. So these lines with the circles mean they're kind of turning each other off. If you provide them both input, then they both get turned on and they both try to turn each other off. One of them will win based on some slight difference in activation, shut the other one off. And then very importantly, it'll have some adaptation over time. So it can't just win forever. It slowly gets weaker and eventually the other one takes over and enjoys a period of its own dominance. So if you plot this over time, it looks something like this. You basically have a flip-flop circuit that goes back and forth. You can do this on a breadboard. It's a pretty simple kind of effect. And all you need is these 2 units that are both being activated, turning each other off, and also get tired when they're on. You can think of this as your eyes kind of wrestling back and forth for dominance. Now, of course, as I said before, binocular rivalry isn't a simple flip-flop with a regular time interval for each eye. It has this characteristic of log normal duration distribution, but all you need to do to capture that is just add some noise to the adaptation rate. So if you wiggle around how much time it takes for each eye to get tired and lose control, that'll actually produce this effect where you have the long tail of longer durations. So that's one nice explanation for why it might have a log normal distribution. Okay, so we have these specific time courses for each subject, which have these 3 states intermixed. How could they be being generated? I wanted to try to think about sort of model classes that might be able to explain this and try to assess them somehow. So the first thing I thought of is you could have what I'm going to call a separate process model, where you have this kind of simple flip-flop circuit in the middle, and then kind of at a higher level, somehow you have fusion competing with it as a whole. The other possibility I'm going to call the single process model has all 3 states, the fusion, the left eye dominant, and the right eye dominant, competing on even ground, and each turning the other two off effectively. So if you want to assess the first type of model, the separate process model, you have to make it more specific so you can actually make predictions, right? This is just a cartoon. Like, what does it mean for fusion to compete with the process of rivalry? The question you have to answer basically is what's going to happen to this rivalry process during a period of fusion? So say you're seeing a combined image, what's going on with the two representations that are only from each eye at that moment? So I thought about this kind of intuitively, and I also found some examples in the literature to build some models from. The first idea is that the rivalry process could just continue. So even though you're seeing it as vertical, maybe somewhere in your brain there's a representation from each eye which is still flipping on and off. This has been seen in some other work, things like invisible rivalrous stimuli. What you can do is take like red and green bars and then flip the red and the green and do this really, really quickly. And it'll just look like a yellow patch. You can't see the bars anymore, or at least you can't report seeing them. And if you do this in each eye and have a different orientation of these bars, which again, you can't see, you can actually pick up using EEG underlying signals in the brain that are competing between those orientations. So even though there's no experience of seeing the bars, there's still some kind of rivalry. And maybe that's what's happening in tristability. There's also the idea that the rivalry process could slow or stop. And this is what happens when you don't pay attention to rivalrous stimuli. This is kind of like the tree falling in the forest question. So if you show somebody two different orientations in the middle of their view, you have them look at them, but then you tell them to do some hard task up here, kind of in the corner of their eye, like read letters or something like that. Then the process of rivalry will actually slow down or stop during that period where attention is moved away. Maybe that's what's happening during tristability. And finally, there's a possibility that it's just somehow interrupted and you're basically kind of resetting whatever dynamics that circuit is doing. And this would be similar to if you just take away a stimulus and then flash it back onto the screen with some periodicity. So every time there's fusion, maybe the states are just kind of destroyed and start over again. So how can we model these different ideas? Well, the first two, continuation model and the stopping model, you can kind of just construct mechanistically. So if you have a set of rivalry on the bottom there, the green and the yellow, and then you have a time course of fusion, you just have to overlap the fusion on top of the rivalry. For the stopping model, you can do something similar. You basically just pause it. You can think of this as infinite slowing instead of no slowing, and it just goes back to wherever it was and then it carries on after the fusion is done. And I also tested some intermediate cases where you have various amounts of slowing just to cover my bases. And the interruption model, I actually used a separate computational model from the literature, which was made to account for these kind of onset effects. It turns out that if you flash something rivalrous on and off, you tend to keep on seeing the same thing you were seeing before. So one eye will keep on winning after you keep doing this flashing. It's more complicated than that, but they made some computational network which can, or system of equations which can predict which eye is going to come back and win. And so I can also compete that against these other models. So what testable predictions might these different ways of generating the three percepts give us? Well, one kind of easy one is looking at the transition order. So every time you go to fusion and then come back, which eye is going to win when you return to the fusion, to the rivalry process? So yeah, this underlying rivalry process. The stopping model would predict that every time you have a period of fusion, you'll come back to the same eye being dominant because the process has stopped. And so when you come back, it's where it was before. The continuation model isn't quite as straightforward. If you have a really short period of fusion and the rivalry is carrying on underneath it, maybe you're unlikely to experience a switch when you come back because the same eye will still be winning. But if you have a really long interruption for a longer period of fusion, maybe it's more like 50-50 because you have these random alternations carrying on while you're seeing the fused state. So the way to figure out what these models would look like and compare them to the actual data I have for my observers is to use bootstrapping. So for each subject, I looked at their reports, and to collect rivalry durations, I just looked at the more extreme cases, 40, 50, and 90, where you had high amounts of orientation disparity. And I just collected all the durations that they reported. So the 5 second, 7 second, whatever the lengths of time they were seeing each of these for. And I got this log normal collection of times. I did the same thing for fusion from the tristable state, because this is the only point where fusion has a duration. So I now have these two repositories of times that are actual data from each subject, and I can draw from them to generate simulated time courses that I can compare against their actual reports. So I basically just do what I suggested earlier. I draw randomly with replacement from each subject, and I construct a made up time course of those durations for rivalry and for fusion. And then for the continuation model, I just kind of paste the fusion times on top of the rivalry. And you can construct the other ones similarly. So we now have all these models, which we can make predictions from that are matched to each subject, and we can now compare their outcomes. So here's what we see. I'm going to compare the amount of returns versus transitions around fusion. So the y-axis is returns, meaning that you start with one eye, you see a vertical, and you go back to the same eye. Transitions means that you switch to the other eye after you come back from fusion. So of course, as we said before, the stopping model is way up against the y-axis. It's always going to predict a return. There's almost never going to be a transition during the stopping model because it just freezes during fusion. The real data, it turns out, if anything, is slightly below the line of equality, meaning that when subjects see a vertical instance, then they'll actually tend to switch to the other eye afterwards. So all of the slowing models and even the continuation model are above this line, meaning that they tended to return back to the same state after a period of fusion, which does not match my data. And the same is true for the interruption model, which, as I said before, when you have these flashes on and off, you actually tend to go back to the same state that you saw before. And that's not what we're seeing in tristability, where you tend to have, if anything, more switches. So one other thing you can look at is the relationship between this pattern where you prefer transitions rather than returns and the duration of the intervening fusion. So the stopping model is simple, it always predicts a return, but the continuation model, like I said, if you have a really long period of fusion, maybe it's going to have more of a 50-50 transition return because you have all these random exchanges happening that you can't see. Whereas a very short instance of fusion should tend to return to the same state. So I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly, but this is another analysis I did where you can see on the x-axis how long the fusion duration was, and the y-axis is now this ratio between returns versus transitions. And you can see this pattern we expect for short durations of fusion. You have mostly returns, and then it goes down to 50-50. And none of these patterns match the real data, which has a totally different trajectory, where longer periods of fusion tend to be more like 50-50, and shorter ones tend to exchange. So I then wanted to look at this single process model idea. And all I did here is basically the same as the flip-flop circuit I explained earlier, but now with 3 units, each of them competing and getting tired, and adding some noise to their adaptation. And that's enough to produce this time course where you have 3 states that flip on and off. And that small amount of noise to the adaptation is actually enough to give you the log normal duration distribution. So again, here's the rivalry we see in real subjects. Their durations are log normally distributed. This single process model with the noise can do the same thing. It has a roughly log normal duration distribution. And what about the transitions versus returns? This model also tends to prefer transitions. I would say the reason for this is probably because as they're competing, whichever unit was winning before the fusion happened is going to be weaker since it had just been adapting itself. And once the fusion ends, the other unit, the third one, can now take over more often. And while this is true if you have a really long period of fusion, maybe this bias towards the previously unseen eye goes away because now the other 2 eyes are more on even footing after this long interval of fusion. And you can see this sort of pattern is kind of qualitatively captured by this simple 3-way competing model. Okay, so this ends the first section, and basically the takeaways are that rivalry and fusion can coexist in a tristable state. Both rivalry and fusion are well described as log normally distributed in terms of how long these states last, which is pretty interesting. And that this whole process is best modeled as a single 3-unit process rather than some kind of hierarchical competition between the mechanisms of fusion and rivalry. So far, I've just been looking at static stimuli. The next chunk is going to look at stimuli that change over time. So I have these static stimuli that I've shown people, just one image in each eye, and they've had this kind of dynamic ongoing switch between the 3 different interpretations that are possible. I assume that the reason for this ongoing dynamic change in perception is because the brain is trying to keep up with potential changes in the real world. So as you move through the world, your inputs are actually changing and your interpretations of them should change as well. So it's useful to have this dynamic process of interpretation. in that view, it would be interesting to see whether your interpretation of this intermediate stimulus changes based on what you were just looking at. So if you were just seeing something which was fusible, and then we slowly shift to this intermediate state, is that going to be different than if you're seeing something that was not fusible and you come to the same point? This is a question of what's known as hysteresis, which is whether the system is history dependent. So does it matter where you came from, or is it just wherever you are decides the behavior of the system? This is similar to the research I gave you at the very beginning, which was about diplopia and fusion, where once these things are fused in each eye, you can pull them apart a little bit further than you might expect. That's another example of hysteresis, where the brain is kind of hanging on to an interpretation. So there was actually a study which looked at this, hysteresis and stereopsis and binocular rivalry, fairly recent, from 2008. And basically what they did is they went from fusible stimuli with slightly different orientations to very large orientation differences. And they just rotated back and forth between these cases. So they either rotate outwards or rotate inwards over time. But since they had this assumption of a threshold between fusion and rivalry, they didn't record what subjects were seeing the whole time. They actually just told them to press a single button when they first saw a different state. So if you're starting from fusion, they would say, press a button the first time you see one or the other. And if you're starting from rivalry, they'd say, press a button the first time they join together into fusion. So here's what they might have expected to see. They're imagining they have this kind of threshold model where fusion happens below a certain disparity and rivalry happens above it. And then they think that if you're starting from fusion and go to rivalry, you might kind of stay in that fused state a little bit longer. So you might have a shift of this threshold. And you can see that when you're going out, the threshold should be further along in orientation disparity than it would if you're going in. And that's indeed what they saw. You can see here that when you start from fusion, you rotate out, the red line here, you can stay fused for longer than if you're rotating in and starting from rivalry. And that difference lasted around like 3.5 seconds of real time when they were rotating at 2 degrees per second. So they also tried different speeds. They went slower, 1 degree per second. Kind of similar outcome, you have around 3 or 4 seconds of difference. And the slowest one was no longer statistically significant, presumably just because it's rotating so slowly that this amount of time is no longer giving you a significant difference between them. But I actually noticed that the difference between these transition points was slightly reversed. It was actually switching slightly earlier, though it wasn't statistically significant. But that got me to start thinking about what the tristable zone would predict about this. So if this is what's really going on, which my research suggests, then when you rotate out from fusion, what you expect to see is a shift in overall probabilities at each disparity, which is a lot harder to pick out with a single number, which is that first moment of transition. So if you're just looking at the first instance of fusion or rivalry, you're not going to get a very good read of this kind of complicated slope of different probabilities of perception. And in fact, because of this tristable zone where all 3 states are possible, if you were to rotate really, really slowly and just hang out at the border for a long time, then if you start from fusion and stay here, you'll eventually see a moment of rivalry, however unlikely. And the same thing if you start from rivalry and rotate in slowly, you'll eventually see a moment of early fusion. So if you're only looking at those first moments of transition, then a very slow rotation speed might actually show you what you might call reverse hysteresis, where the system, instead of hanging on to the state it was in, seems kind of eager to switch to the other state. So I basically made an experiment to reproduce what they did and then try an even slower condition. So I took their 2 degree per second rotation condition, and I also added in a 1/4 degree per second condition, very slow. Here's a little cartoon of my experimental design. You can see I'm going between 10 degrees and 50 degrees of orientation disparity. I have fast trials, which cover this distance in orientation space in 20 seconds, rotating out or in, and I have slow trials, which take 160 seconds to go that distance. I did 10 slow trials, 5 each way, and 20 fast ones for 11 subjects. So everything about the actual reporting that the subjects were doing was basically the same as in the first experiment. I have my planar where they're seeing different things in each eye. I have these very similar stimuli, but now they're slowly rotating. I didn't mention this rotation to any of the observers, so I just gave them the same instructions. I said, press these keys based on what you're seeing at any point in time and let go of all of them if you're not sure. So here's what I found. If you look at the first switch transitions, so I basically just reproduced the analysis that was done earlier. I found the first moment of a different percept. You do see hysteresis. I got around 2.5 seconds of hysteresis. But if you look at the slow condition, you get this really significant and strange looking reverse hysteresis, which I expected to find, where when you're rotating out from fusion, you switch to rivalry really early. And when you're rotating in, vice versa. So since I do have continuous reports where subjects were telling me what they saw at each point, I can instead look at this in a richer way by just binning in some kind of arbitrary binning way what subjects were seeing over time. So let's look at these red curves first. The red curves are rotating out. So here we have fusion. People are seeing pretty much entirely fusion as it starts to rotate apart. And then slowly the amount of fusion goes down and the amount of rivalry comes up. That's rotating out quickly. Now, if we rotate in quickly, we see that the curves have actually shifted like we expected. So there is this hysteresis where there's a difference between the probabilities. But we can see the difference here is around 4.5 seconds of shift in those curves, which is much more than the around 2 or 3 seconds I got using the first switch analysis. So this shows that it's important to use this richer analysis if you're going to try to measure the hysteresis, rather than just the first switch transition. If you look at the slow rotation condition, there's basically no shift visible. Again, this is probably due to the fact that it's so slow that even though you're kind of sticking to what you were just seeing, the thing you were just seeing is basically the same as what you're seeing now, since it's changing very, very slowly. And so this difference of maybe 3 or 4 seconds is no longer significant on this scale where you have 160 seconds across the whole thing. Okay, so I wanted to do the same thing as before and try to see what I could learn about what could be generating this kind of shift in perception. My first question was, can this single process model capture this effect? So I did have to make one small change to it, which was inspired by other research into hysteresis, which is to add self-facilitation. You can think of this as just a winner's bonus. So whichever unit is on is going to boost itself a little bit and stay on a bit longer. This gives us this kind of stickiness that you expect to see in hysteresis. So in order to simulate a hysteresis trial, as I did in this experiment with this model, I basically just started by giving the fusion node all of the input and very little to the right and left eye dominant nodes to simulate fused inputs. And at the other end of the spectrum, I have the right and left eye nodes having high inputs and the fusion node having a very low input. And you can just kind of interpolate and provide different amounts of input over the course of the trial. And you'll get something like this, which seems about right. You start from fusion, you actually go through a little tristable zone, and then you end up in rivalry, where this little pair of subunits is engaging in rivalry. So we can do the same analysis with these kinds of models, these simulated time courses. And we can see that the first switch transitions do show hysteresis. And if you rotate really slowly and change these values over a longer period of time, you see this reverse effect due to the tristable zone. And if you show it cumulatively, it also looks somewhat similar, qualitatively speaking, where you have a shift in the curves at the fast rotation condition and not as much in the slow one. So this basically told me that this simple little motif with the 3 competing nodes that have some noise in their adaptation and they facilitate their own activity when they're on is enough to capture the kinds of phenomena we're seeing in hysteresis. But of course, the way that I'm simulating this is a little bit ad hoc and not very realistic. I'm just giving more input to one node than the other 2 and then switching over time. So I wanted to see if this kind of model chunk would be able to do this in a larger, more complex and realistic model. So the model I chose to go off from is this attention model of binocular rivalry by Xinhong Li and colleagues in 2017. And this model was built to capture a bunch of different effects. I'm just going to go through some of them right now. First of all, of course, it rivals when each eye sees one orientation. That's important. It doesn't rival when both eyes see both. So if you just feed in kind of a waffle-looking plaid to each eye, then it'll fuse. You won't have any competition, which you shouldn't have. It doesn't rival when attention isn't active. So like I said earlier, if you're not paying attention to the stimulus, then you don't actually see any rivalry. And this model can do that too. And it also obeys Levelt's laws in terms of switch rates and things like that. Levelt's laws are a set of laws that were divined by Levelt a long time ago, who was another PhD student studying rivalry. And he found a bunch of relationships between the relative contrasts of stimuli and how much of the time they would be visible in each eye and how long they would be visible and all these other things. So basically, it acts like rivalry is expected to act, and it also can capture this attention dependency. Okay, so here's a cartoon from the authors themselves of their model. We have the left eye and we have the right eye. Each eye has 2 units which respond to this orientation or this one. We have a summation layer, which takes input from the matching orientations in both eyes. And then we have an attention layer, which is fed up by the summation layer and is shut off by the opposing orientation. And on the sides, we have these opponency circuits, which help with rivalry. So I'm going to go one step further into this while still being a bit vague, just to give you an idea of how this model works. There's 2 sort of sub-circuits that the authors highlight. The first is the attentional modulation sub-circuit. This is basically just feedback from the attention layer. So if this unit here is on, you're attending to this orientation, then that orientation in both eyes will be activated and vice versa. And that allows you to have this dependency on attention. And then you have these mutual inhibition circuits on the sides, which are taking the difference between each eye. So this one's looking at right eye minus left eye. So if you see this in your right eye and you don't see this in your left eye, you have a big difference signal. And that's going to have the left eye in general be shut off. And this is part of how the system can rival back and forth. Okay, so here is their general model. I wanted to modify it to try to make some predictions about hysteresis and tristability. So the first thing I had to do is, as I said again way in the beginning, this model was only made to account for rivalry. So there actually isn't an intermediate node that can represent a fusion state. So I just had to add that throughout. And I assume the authors just used these for simplicity, and they really meant to imply a whole range of different orientations that can be seen. So I just added one in the middle, which was vertical across all these layers. And the next change I made is I moved the inhibition from the summation to attention layer to be within the attention layer. And the reason I did this is because the way I styled it here, you can see it results in basically a copy of my little subunit, my single process model, sitting at the top here in the attention layer. So we now have these 3 different units, which are representing the different orientations, left, right, and up, and they're each competing with each other and getting some kind of input. So we can now take this model and run it and see if this addition of this kind of motif is enough to make it capture the hysteresis effects we expect. So the first thing, of course, is to check whether it still works, whether I've broken it by doing this. And it turns out happily that it does still work. It can do all the things it was made to do. Now I wanted to check whether it can do this hysteresis, reverse hysteresis thing with the first switch analysis and whether the curve, the continuous curve shifts. So here is that data. You can see that with fast rotation, you have 2 or 3 seconds again of hysteresis. And with a slow rotation, you do see this massive reverse hysteresis effect. And in the continuous case, again, we have a similar look here where you have the curves shifting for the fast rotation case and not as much for the slow rotation case. So the takeaways from this section are that hysteresis does exist between rivalry and fusion. That is to say, your brain is kind of sticky in which state it's interpreting the world to be in. But if you want to measure this, you have to use continuous reports because, as I have now shown, the space between fusion and rivalry isn't just a hard threshold you can measure with a single switch, but it's a more complicated profile of probabilities that you have to measure out this way. A single 3-unit process can behave similarly to what we see. So this little model, though it's really, really simple, has enough different dynamic properties that it can do the hysteresis we expect. And a more complex model can also be made to act this way if it contains this motif. So hopefully this maybe means that this type of motif is sufficient wherever it's put into the model to cause this kind of effect. So we should take away that maybe we just need 3 competing elements that are self-facilitating and also adapt somewhere in the model to allow for the kind of hysteresis we're seeing. Okay, so finally we come to some kind of conclusion. Back to our original cartoon of prior views. Things were that people thought about binocular fusion as kind of a successful, stable solution to this correspondence problem. Then there was maybe some implied threshold similarity. And then you have rivalry, where you have a failure of normal vision in lab settings. This new cartoon I'd like to propose is more about the perceptual interpretations themselves. So the problem your brain is facing is trying to decide what it's seeing in the world. Is it seeing something through one eye, as in the case of that plinth where you can just see one edge with one eye? Is it seeing something through the other eye? Or is it seeing something through both eyes? And depending on where you are in this space, you might see different dynamics. So if it's clearly something you're seeing with both eyes, you'll have binocular fusion. And maybe the best way to model this is a simple input-output model with no real dynamics, as we saw in earlier models of fusion. If you're kind of between two eyes and you're not sure which eye's input is the most meaningful or relevant to what you're trying to do behaviorally, maybe the best model is this toggle model of binocular rivalry, where you're switching back and forth across this boundary. And if you're in the middle where all three seem to be possible, as I constructed in my experiments, then maybe you need this full model where you have all three cases competing with each other. And implicitly, you can assume that this model is the case all across this space. But since different parts of it are getting input based on what you're seeing, the dynamics change and different parts of it are sufficient to account for the behavior you see. So presumably at any moment in time in this perceptual interpretation space, your perception sits somewhere and it's traveling through it as you dynamically change your perception. So in this context, you can think of hysteresis as being a useful prior, where you're thinking about what did you believe a moment ago? You want to have this smooth change of perception over time so that you have continuity in what you're seeing and you're not jumping around and seeing unrelated things very quickly. So by having this sort of stickiness, you're taking into account what you previously decided about the world based on your inputs, and you'll shift your percepts based on what you recently saw. And presumably this is also happening all across the visual field. So again, everything I've studied is also limited in that it's been in one particular point of your visual field right at the center. But presumably this is happening all across your visual field as you go about your life. This dynamic process is trying to figure out the best way to interpret the two views from each eye. So I think this is an interesting sort of recasting of fusion and rivalry instead of these maybe mutually exclusive perceptual mechanisms, as being part of this larger pattern of what's called perceptual multi-stability. So one example, as I showed you in the beginning, was monocular rivalry, where you switch between seeing one pattern and the other over time. There are a bunch of famous ones like the Necker cube, the face vase, and the duck rabbit, where it seems like some higher level interpretation of the stimulus in your brain is kind of switching back and forth without you meaning for it to. So your brain is deciding the cube looks like this, and then eventually it looks like this, back and forth. You're seeing faces and vases and things like that. And some of these dynamics also seem to have similar time courses and duration distributions as rivalry does. So maybe there's some unifying purpose here. Even more broadly, this has been seen in other senses. So if you put different sounds into people's ears, they'll actually switch back and forth and they'll hear from one ear at a time. And most bizarrely, there's binaural rivalry, where you can put different smells into each nostril and you'll actually smell from each nostril at a time. So it seems like something kind of fundamental is going on here, and fusion and rivalry are a part of it. My final takeaways then are something like this. Fusion and rivalry can engage in multi-stable perception. This can be modeled as competition between the three interpretations, the left eye view, the right eye view, and the fused view. And both fusion and rivalry as mechanisms might be seen as part of this larger effort by the brain to constantly form useful inputs, useful percepts from uncertain inputs as your vision changes over time. Okay, so I'm going to have a thank you section at the end, but now I'm going to pause for Q&A. If anybody has questions, they can put them in the chat.
Guillaume, are you able to read the chat section, or should we read you some of the questions?
I'll take a look. Thank you for all the clapping. I appreciate it. Isabel Lowe asks about ocular dominance. That's a very good question that I tried to get rid of. So some people have, everybody has a slightly dominant eye, kind of like you have handedness. One of your eyes tends to be the preferred one. And this can definitely affect things like rivalry. To an extreme case, you can be like partially blind in one eye, or somebody can have an inability to combine the images from each eye. That can definitely be an issue. And so one thing I screened for in my subjects is the ability to see stereo images, you know, like magic eye ones. Basically, you have random dot patterns in each eye. And even though the patterns themselves are random, there's slight differences between the patterns, which otherwise match, which your brain, when they're lined up, can interpret in 3D ways. So you can extract this depth information from the differences between these otherwise random patterns, and you can see like a pop out in your image. That's how those magic eye things work. So I basically checked if people could see those kinds of stimuli. And if they could, I gave them a good score on my stereopsis ability, and I let them into the study. And if they couldn't, then I assumed that they didn't have a good ability to see this, or maybe one eye was too dominant. So I basically just avoided that question, but I think it's very interesting. Okay, Ethan asks about how far back might the prior go? What about the cumulative experience with particular stimuli? Yeah, that's a particularly good question because I had these poor subjects looking at these kinds of things for like an hour or so. So I don't know exactly about these larger scale hysteresis effects. Presumably some part of the way that your perception works is based on what you've learned over the course of your life in terms of what strategy is best for creating a percept that matches the real world. Like when you try to reach out to something, is it there? Those sorts of things. It's an interesting question, kind of implicitly you're asking as to whether this kind of stimulus that I'm doing could be kind of learned, or like people might change their perception of it over time based on what they're doing. It's hard to say since there's no real feedback, like there's no reward involved in this circuit. They're just saying what they see over time. But I can say that all of my subjects have pretty consistent results. So based on what I found, just the data, it looks like the prior is maybe like 2 to 4 seconds, something like that, at least in the small scale. I hope that answers your question.
So Guillaume, Brian Rondell has a question. Do you think the same rules will hold in the periphery as in the fovea? And also, do you think the rules for color will be like those for pattern?
Very interesting. So in the periphery, you have kind of larger units of vision. So in the fovea, you have very precise vision where you can see things with high detail and less so in the periphery. I think that rivalry in the periphery, as far as I know, is generally similar. I mean, you might have larger blocks of it happening. So one thing I didn't talk about is that you can have sort of piecemeal rivalry where you have kind of waves of dominance going across your vision. And it seems like there are like minimum units of visual space which can be dominant at a particular time. So that should definitely be different in the periphery, but I don't have any reason to believe that the dynamics themselves would be different in the periphery. And color, I don't know much about, honestly. I'm aware that color rivalry exists, but I also don't have a reason to think that the dynamics would be different. So I'd be interested to see what happens in the fusion case. I don't know if color fusion is as possible, especially if you have different impossible colors to combine, like blue and yellow. I'm not sure about that. It's a good question.
So you have a couple questions from Greg Hoy, and I'll just read this one. Would your model hold true with people that can only see through one eye?
Well, like I said to Isabel, it's kind of hard to stretch it to them because they wouldn't have the other eye's input. But of course, as I showed you, there's still some phenomena which can have these kinds of dynamics, even if only one eye is seeing them, like that monocular rivalry pattern that you just look at would work with one eye. So I assume that the same perceptual problems are presented to people with one eye and that they need to decide what they're looking at. And that may not be a decision between the interpretations that each eye is suggesting, but between something else like the Necker cube or other things like that. In that sense, I assume they would also be able to have tristable perception of some stimuli, but they couldn't be binocular stimuli, obviously.
I'll read another question from Ian Eisenberg. So, is transition from fusion to other viewing states useful visual, quote unquote, exploration? And do you think there could be a stimulus where there are garden path fusions that could be overcome through binocular exploration?
Great question. I need to think for a second what you mean by garden path fusions. There are some stimuli. So I thought a bit, I had a part, as Justin said, I spent a lot of my time in my PhD struggling to figure out what I was going to do. And one thing I was thinking about was having different Necker cubes in each eye. So if you have like a Necker cube like this in one eye and this in the other eye, then like each eye could be dominant and then switch between two views, or the fused Necker cube could also go back and forth. So I was thinking about, maybe this is what you're getting at with like garden path fusion interpretations, where you have these sort of higher level things. I didn't actually do that work because it was too confusing, but there are some other stimuli people have used, like plaids, moving plaids. You can have like a set of bars going this way and a set of bars going this way. And you can switch between mostly seeing this one, mostly seeing this one, or mostly seeing them go together. So that's another example of like tristable multi-stable perception stuff. In terms of whether this is useful, yeah, some people have kind of pitched this in the Bayesian framework of saying, you know, you need to be exploring the space of what possible worlds might be out there based on what you're seeing. And you can certainly think of this that way, thinking of fusion and left and right eye dominance as potential realities, potential representations of what's really out in the world. And then maybe over time, you're kind of sampling from these different durations. There was a paper that pitched it that way that I saw. I think that could be an interesting viewpoint too.
Inyo Mingola has this question: does your work shed any light on Da Vinci's stereopsis, where the brain is confident that two eyes are seeing some feature and one eye is seeing the other?
Yes, so that is he's referring to like the plinth example, where you have one edge that's visible in one eye but not visible in the other eye. And I don't know super much about this, but as I said, in these cases which are called Da Vinci stereopsis, basically the eye that has the better view, for lack of a better word, is stably seen. I don't know exactly how this fits into the dynamics. I mean, one way to put it, if I go back to my, here we go. Go back to my slide with the perceptual layout. You can think of Da Vinci stereopsis as being kind of further from the boundary between the two eyes, being equivalently informative. So if one eye just sees like a dark shadow and the other eye sees something that you want to look at, then maybe you're kind of far up in this space, and that allows that eye to just be infinitely dominant and the other one is just suppressed. I think that would make sense. I'm very curious about Da Vinci stereopsis. There's some weird issues in terms of how you sort out that wrinkle if you allow one eye to see an extra bit of space inside of what the other eye can see. I still don't really understand how that works. I don't know if that's been explored fully yet.
So I think we'll probably just take, there's a bunch of questions, but maybe we'll just take one or two and then so you can close up. I'll take this one from Jean-Paul Noel. Guillaume, how do you think your results would change if the quote match conditions, less disparity, were not at the vertical orientation? We know that natural distributions for orientations in the environment emphasize vertical and horizontal orientations. There are more encoding resources allocated to those orientations. But what is more useful for quote unquote representation is not what is more useful for quote unquote inference. For inference, statistic unlikely events are most informative.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So one thing I didn't talk about at all is that I did do a section in my first project where I looked at orientation disparities around the horizontal axis. So this is still, of course, one of the two axes which are most prevalent in the world, as Jean-Paul said. But there was similar dynamics and a similar profile. It was a bit narrower. There was like less allowance for fusion with different orientation disparities there. That makes sense. So some of these differences come from just geometry. If you have something, since your eyes are horizontally located, that's tilted towards you or away from you, then you'll have kind of changes around the vertical. But it's rarer to see changes around the horizontal or more intermediate axes because of the way that the two vantage points are arranged. But I think that's a really interesting question. I'd have to think more about exactly what real cases would have fusion points that are between, I guess, just like things that are angled this way. So you would definitely expect that to be possible. And yeah, beyond just the orientations, which are most present in like pictures of the world, there's also this question of which orientation disparities are most present. I'm not really familiar with that, but I think that's interesting.
Okay, so I think let's end the questions for now. There are a few more, but since they're in the chat, maybe you can kind of converse after this with those people. And
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming and watching this. I hope you're all safe and well in strange times. Okay, so we'll move to the private session, which is a different Zoom meeting. Thanks. So I was so excited to finish my defense that I completely forgot to do my acknowledgements section. I'm back now, it's a bit later, and I'm gonna record it separately, and then this will just be tacked on to the YouTube video. First, of course, I wanted to thank my PIs, Justin and Tony. They were really incredible to work with. I feel so lucky to have had them both as mentors. Just really thoughtful and kind people. Justin has taught me so much about how to be a good scientist, how to read papers, and progress experimental design. Tony seems to have boundless knowledge of perceptual science and always has the right citation and the right idea for the next development in a project. I really appreciate how they both gave me so much leeway to develop my own work and pursue things that I found interesting. I particularly appreciate how much effort Justin put into making sure that I could pursue my interest in education by, as he earlier said, letting me develop materials for his Intro to Cognitive Neuroscience class, which was an amazing experience to have access to. And he also encouraged me in a lot of other extra research activities where I explored my other interests in education throughout my degree. I'd also like to thank my committee members for all of your time throughout the years, giving feedback and pushing me forward at all different stages of my work. I really appreciate you being here today to see it all come full circle. So Gardner Lab doesn't have a lab photo as such, so I just stuck people all around. We're a fairly small lab. Everyone here has been a great impact on my degree. A special shout out to Akshay for being our moderator today. I appreciate you doing that. And it's just been really nice to have you guys around to support each other and to tear apart papers together in lab meeting. It was great to get to know you and see where your work has been going, and I look forward to hearing more about what you get up to in the future. Tony's lab is much larger, but equally full of wonderful people. Those I worked most closely with were Wesley, Peter, Nathan, and Jorge, and they all helped me move my work forward in their own different ways. Of course, I have to shout out to my cohort, the class of 2015. They weren't all in this photo. This is the best one I could find, so I used my Photoshop skills once more to add in the missing folks. I just had so much fun with you guys. I really feel like we had a great chemistry throughout, especially our first year when we were all thrown together in boot camp. I have a lot of great memories of getting to know you all. And I'm just so pleased to have been doing a PhD in the midst of such interesting and kind and just wonderful people. I'm very excited to see where your work has taken you. I know we've all kind of spread out across campus over the years. I look forward to seeing your defenses in the coming months and years. Speaking of wonderful people, 5 years is a pretty long time, and there are a lot of people along the way who have touched my life and brought me on awesome adventurous places. I appreciate all of your support and all of the great memories I've made with you all. Special shout out to Ian and Dan, my honorary office mates. Even though I decided to work in a small dark office, which was best for my productivity, sometimes I did need some socializing. And I really appreciate you guys always being there to talk to me and help me through things inside and outside of lab. Thanks to my family for always supporting me and everything that I've done. Even when I had doubts about things, you're always telling me that it'll be fine no matter what happens, and I really appreciate that. And also, of course, the slew of amazing photos of my adorable nieces, which has always picked me up in my days of work. A most special shout out to my rickety bicycle, who on a fateful November day in 2016 blew out a back tire, which led me to take the Uber pool where I met Sarah. And Sarah immediately wooed me with tales of her research into future discounting and pigeons, which I, of course, was very taken with. Sarah has just been my North Star since, and I really appreciate having her by my side as a partner, especially literally right now in these times. I feel so lucky that we can be together, and I'm really excited to see where our adventures take us in the future. Finally, of course, my dogs. Izzy, the Maltipoo, who came as a package deal with Sarah, has taught me so much about the importance of going outside and taking cuddle breaks for mental health. And most recently, Benji, the Havanese puppy who joined us a little over a week ago now, is now Izzy's little brother. I love him deeply already, but I'm still getting to know him every day. He's developing quite a little character. Izzy is still not quite sure what to make of him as a brother and the impact that he's had in her life, but they seem to have a lot in common, and I think that soon they'll be thick as thieves. They're starting to get along better and better each day, and I'm so excited to see them going forward as little siblings in our family. So thank you so much all for coming, everybody, for taking the time out of your days to join in and see what I've been up to. All my friends and family and coworkers who have checked this out, I really appreciate you watching. Random people on YouTube who are watching this, thank you for taking the time again. I hope you're all doing all right. I hope you're watching this in the far future where quarantine and all of this stuff is a distant memory. Take care.